Well, good morning.
Morning.
I have been running around like a chicken with my head cut off down here in Chattanooga this morning. We'll give it another minute or two, waiting on everybody to get in. You guys have your purchase and sale agreement?
hmm
Well, it's 10 o'clock, so I want to uh, start because there's at least three of you that were on time. Yay! That's a realtor thing that we make fun of all the time. It's realtor time, not real time. But so we're going to start talking about Section 2 of the Purchase and Sale Agreement today. And I hope you like this, breaking it down into little chunks. Hopefully, it'll help you understand it a little bit more. I know it's a lot to take like a 4-hour class, and then you got to go back and take it again just so you can make sure you get a hold of everything. But Section 2 is all about the purchase price, the method of payment, and the closing expenses. And it's pretty simple, the first few lines of Section 2. I probably need to turn my phone off, but let's make sure this is not an agent who can't get in. Okay, all right. Turn that phone off. So it's pretty easy at line 39 to understand that you put the purchase price in there. Okay, most title companies are doing wire transfers now, and that's the reason we have the wire fraud notice and all of that stuff that we deal with. But most buyers who are working with a lender the lender will be the one that will decide the wire transfer or whatever. However, when you have a cash buyer, sometimes they'll ask you, do I need to bring a cashier's check or a wire transfer? And you should always tell them you need to wait and find out what the title company wants you to do, because there's some title companies that they will only do wire transfers. Okay, so when you're talking about purchase price with your buyer, if it's a lender, you really don't have to worry about it. It will more than likely be a wire transfer. But when you're dealing with a cash buyer, sometimes they'll ask you that question of what they need to bring. So the first thing that comes up in Section 2 after you put in the purchase price is the financial contingency. So what the Forms Committee has done is taken a large assumption that says anybody that's buying a house will probably be getting a loan. Okay, so we'll address that first in this paragraph. So the line number 46 there has a blank where you put a percentage. And this is the amount of money that the buyer is going to borrow from the bank, a certain percentage of the purchase price. Okay, it could be, some people might call it a loan to value. What are they going to loan on this property? So it depends on your buyer. Okay,
And again, I didn't know I got it.
for a minute to get set up.
I think that's
All right. So it depends on the buyer. You're going to have to ask the buyer. So what kind of loan are you getting from the lender? okay? If they're getting an FHA, kind of a normal thing for an FHA loan is that they're going to borrow 96.5% of the money, okay? If it is a VA loan, normally it's 100% of the money. If it's a conventional loan, it could be any percent. It could be 80%, 20%, 70%. So you're going to have to talk to them, the buyers and or the lenders, and then put a number in that blank. Now, of course, the buyer may not know right up front what they're going to do because some buyers get things backwards, right? They want to go look at houses first and then get with the lender. We always try to avoid that by telling them to go on to the lender because we do have to fill some of this information out. And in my area down here in Chattanooga, we basically deal with conventional and FHA. We don't do a whole lot of VAs. But if you go up towards Clarksville, Tennessee, I go up there and teach for that association sometimes, and they do all VAs. They don't know how to do anything else except VAs, basically. So this section here is to let the seller know how much the buyer is going to be borrowing. And why does the seller need to know that? Well, if the seller's in a multiple offer situation and the buyer is getting a 100% loan, and then you have another buyer that's paying cash, and maybe even another buyer that's doing FHA, they've got three choices there in front of them to make, right? And so a lot of times they will go with the transaction that they feel will be the least complicated. And of course, that would be the cash one, right? And a lot of times that doesn't sit real well with me because that means the veteran gets left out. And we're a veteran family. My son's still active duty military, so I don't like that. But the seller is the one who makes the choice. That's why you have to put this in here. And if you put 100% in, a lot of times you're talking about USDA and maybe THDA type loans also. So those are just the kind of things that you have to communicate to the seller so they can make a decision about if they want to accept the offer or not. So then here on line 48 is where you have the first mention of a term that's called good faith. It says, in consideration of buyer having acted in good faith and in accordance with the terms below, being unable to obtain financing by the closing date, the sufficiency of such consideration being hereby acknowledged, buyer may terminate this agreement by providing written notice via the notification form or equivalent written notice. So the term good faith is actually the foundation of all contracts because anybody that they go under contract with each other, they both have to act in good faith. Okay, so they're saying, I am going to do this. And so good faith is huge. And you will see that in a lot, maybe not a lot, but a lot of court cases when it goes to court, somebody might bring up that this party or that party did not act in good faith. In other words, they quit communicating. They just would not communicate and do what the agreement called for them to do. So you'll see that term two or three times in the document, but in contract law itself, the term good faith is the foundation of all contracts, basically. So the buyer, if they go and they try to get a loan and they can't get a loan, then the lender will issue them what's called a loan denial letter, okay? And it says here that the seller shall have the right to request any supporting documentation regarding loan denial and that the buyer gets their earnest money back if they can't get a loan and they get a loan denial. So here's the best practice. So you're working with a buyer and maybe they went to a lender and that's how you knew they were going to get an FHA loan. But then when the lender actually pulled their information, their credit report, and got their verifications of employment and stuff like that, they found out the buyer would not be able to purchase. Okay, so they're going to issue a loan denial letter. The best practice is that when you send over that notification form and let the seller know that the buyer did not qualify for a loan, that they've got this loan denial letter, go ahead and send the loan denial letter. That makes everybody feel all warm and fuzzy and trust each other. Okay. If you just send the notification form over and check the box that says, hey, they can't get a loan, then they're going to be going, okay, you need to prove to me they can't get a loan, which it says in here that the seller has the right to request that. So let's just do it up front. Let's be, I think Todd likes to use this word, let's be the Cadillac real estate offices, okay? Let's do it to where people trust us and they like doing business with Weichert agents. That's definitely what we want to do. But if they are moving forward with the loan, okay, as you're reading on down through here, when you get to lines 54 through 57, you've got to check what kind of loan they're getting. Okay, you just check one box. And sometimes with THDA, they'll get the THDA FHA, and you might have to check both of those boxes. But you normally wouldn't check like conventional loan and VA loan. That doesn't happen, okay? If it's other here, people always ask, what is other? Well, other could be, is the seller going to carry the note back? I don't know. You don't see that much anymore. Is it an assumption? You don't see that. I hadn't seen that in 20 years, I'll be real honest with you. But could it come back? Absolutely, it could come back, especially if the interest rate goes up a whole lot. Also, other can be used, you check that box if they have a house to sell before they buy the one they're offering on. Okay? You would check other here and put C, special stipulations, and the form, buyer's first right of refusal, which is the RF 623 form. And that would give them an indication that they're really not getting a loan. They're going to be doing something else as far as financing goes. Okay? It goes on to say in 58 through 61 that the buyer can apply for a loan with different terms and conditions and close the transaction provided all other terms and conditions of the agreement are fulfilled and the new loan does not increase any charges to the seller, and that is key. The buyer can change loan types. That's not a problem as long as that loan does not increase cost charged to the seller. So that's the question you got to ask the lender if the buyer is going to change their loan type. Is the seller going to be responsible for any costs if the buyer changes to this loan type? You will definitely see that if the buyer is getting a conventional loan and they switch to a VA loan. And sometimes even an FHA loan. It depends on the lender what the FHA and VA loan non-allowables are. So non-allowables in a loan is that this loan program will not allow a buyer to pay certain fees, so then the seller will be responsible for paying those. That's why that sentence is there. So in a VA loan, they have non-allowable fees, and an FHA loan has non-allowable fees. However, the FHA loan, a lot of the banks have started just eating those. They don't really charge those to anybody at this point. So that's a question also for the lender when you have a buyer that's getting an FHA or a VA loan. Are there any non-allowables? That's the phrase you're looking for. Are there any non-allowables? Okay. And the lenders will all know what that is, and they'll tell you if there are or if they're not. It does say here on line 59 through 61, buyer shall be obligated to close this transaction if buyer has the ability to obtain a loan with terms as described herein and or any other loan for which buyer has applied and been approved. So if the buyer can get a loan, they got to buy this house. They don't just walk away. Now, we don't see this much anymore today, but I can tell you prior to October of 2015, lenders would write a loan denial letter if the buyer just changed his mind and didn't want to buy the house. And we had a lot of yah-yahing going on back then. But these days, because when the real estate market fell out, the lenders lost so much money and the government had to step in under the Dodd-Frank Act. Now lenders they get dings against their mortgage license if they have buyers that get foreclosed on and things like that. And so they're very specific about loan denial letters now. They won't just print them. They won't just print them. So they actually have to be executed out of the new loan program softwares that they're all using now. And that was something that the government put out. And all that changed back in 2015. So if you've not been licensed since 2015, uh, I mean, since before 2015, you haven't noticed there's any difference. Those old people are the ones who have had to figure out a new way to deal with everything. Any questions about that first section at all? About talking to lenders and such? Your relationship with your lender is extremely important, whether it's your buyer or whether you represent the seller. You don't want to ever burn bridges. You know, you want to be able to pick up the phone and call a lender. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree 100% of the time, but you have to handle it tactfully when you don't agree. I mean, you know, you don't want to tell anybody off and call them bad names because that would not be good. It just wouldn't be good. All right, now we're going to get to this section, and I think this section, lines 62 through 83, are one of the most ignored sections of the purchase and sale agreement. And that is the fault of the real estate licensees. Let me find something here real quick. I should have had it pulled up already. I'm sorry. Our internet went completely down yesterday, and I have been dealing with that, and EPB just left. They got it back up, but still no phones. I can call out, but nobody can call in. So I'm going to try to get this to open up because in my classes that I teach for CE credit, I have a slide, and I wanted to share that with you guys because it's important to understand what's going on in the purchase and sale agreement. That way, when we understand, then we can deal with things better. I just have to see. Here's where we are. Thought it was right up in here somewhere. Oh, here it is. So here's the legal definition of thou shall. Okay, I know you guys are seeing my cheat sheet and everything over here, but of the word shall. So every time you see the word shall in the documents, any documents you're using, buyer shall, seller shall, then that is what is called under contract law, legal law, an imperative command. They're mandatory and not permissive. If it says may, you know, that's a permissive provision, which, you know, you might do it or you might not. But shall means you're going to do it, okay? So that's something I want you to remember every time you see the word shall anywhere in any of the documents you're doing. And you see it multiple times in this loan obligation section. Buyer shall, buyer shall, buyer shall, which means the buyer has to do it. There's nothing in this section that gives the buyer any other alternative, okay? But what happens is the real estate agent doesn't make sure the buyer does it, okay? Because, you know, we don't do that up here. We don't do that down here. We don't do that in Cleveland. We don't do that in Chattanooga. We don't do that in Athens or Etowah or Decatur or wherever you're at. But the fact of the matter is, it don't matter if you do it or not. The contract says you're supposed to be doing it, okay? So under this loan obligations paragraph, there are things that the buyer shall make happen within timelines, okay? And the first one is within 3 days after the binding agreement date, buyer shall make application for the loan and pay for the credit report. Buyer shall immediately notify seller or seller's representative of having applied for the loan and provide lender's name and contact information, and that buyer has instructed lender to order credit report. Such certification shall be made via the notification form or equivalent written notice. So I'm going to tell you right now, we would all prefer that you use the notification form because that is something the buyer and the seller sign. And in real estate contract law, in order for it to be enforced against the buyer or the seller, they have to sign it. Okay, so if you shoot me an email, the buyer or the seller, that's not coming from them. They haven't signed anything. That's just you shooting me an email telling me something. And a lot of people try to do that and say, well, that's equivalent written notice. Well, it's not because it's not from the buyer. Okay? The buyer has to make this notice. So for the buyer to make this notice, then you need to be utilizing the RF 656 notification form. Okay? And It's pretty self-explanatory, to be honest with you. You come in and you say, okay, who's notifying who? So in this instance, if the buyer is notifying that they've made application for the loan, it would mean the buyer's notifying the seller, the property address, and at this point you would be using the binding agreement date. There's a couple of notifications on this form that it can be made prior to going under contract, but that's not what we're talking about now. So you put in the binding agreement date, and right here, number one says the buyer's made application for the loan and instructed the lender to order and paid for the credit report, and here's the lender's name and contact information, which is exactly what the purchase and sale agreement says they're going to do right here within 3 days. Okay, so that's what you as the real estate licensee need to be doing, is staying on top of these timelines and sending this stuff over. Now, I'm going to be very honest with you. Before I started this class, as soon as we got back internet this morning, I had to send over a demand for compliance because the real estate agent, we went under contract January 31st, and we've not heard hide nor hair for anything. They had a 10-day time limit for their home inspection. They didn't do it. They had this 3-day thing. They didn't do it. So we have just this morning, number one, made demand for compliance and reminded them that they're now accepting the property as is because they did not do their home inspection. I'm super concerned because I've not heard a word from this real estate agent. And so I just sent this over for my sellers to sign, and it's an estate, and there's 5 of them, so they probably won't get it signed till sometime this afternoon because of that. But you, if you represent the seller, you have to stay on top of this too. If you don't get it, how do you know that the buyer is moving forward in their lending process? Because under the Dodd-Frank Act, the buyer cannot make full loan application. They can't be entered into the lender's system. A loan estimate can't be generated until they're under contract, because the lenders have to have 6 pieces of information to get them into their system. Now, they can go in and pre-qualify them and check their credit. They can do that stuff, but they can't start the loan process until they're under contract. So that's why this is like this. And that's a CFPB Dodd-Frank Act rule. It has nothing to do with the Forms Committee making this stuff up. This is following federal law, okay? So you've got to make sure that you, as the agent representing that buyer, is making this happen. And if it's not happening, then if you represent the seller, you got to ask the seller what they want to do. And so when we talked to our seller, we said we hadn't heard hide nor hair of them. And they said, well, what do we need to do? And so we pointed them back to their copy of the agreement and said, here's what you can do, because it says down here in lines 80 through 83, should buyer fail to timely comply with section 2A1, which is this 3-day thing, okay, and or 2A2, which is the 14-day thing, which we're about to talk about, and provide notice as required, the seller may make written demand for compliance via the notification form or equivalent written notice. If buyer does not furnish seller the requested documentation within 2 days after such demand for compliance, buyer shall be considered in default and seller's obligation to sell is terminated. So what happens when a buyer's in default? When a buyer's in default, they forfeit their earnest money according to Section 13 of this agreement that they have with the seller. Okay, so I call this the demand for compliance dance. You'll see that demand for compliance dance several places throughout the document. So if I call it that again, you'll know what it is. It's the demand for compliance dance, okay? So 3 days from the binding agreement date. So if we go binding today on 2/11, this is day 0. Day 1 is Saturday. Day 2 is Sunday. Day 3 is Monday. So by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, you have to send this information over to the seller, or the seller can then demand compliance. Okay? Any questions on that one? Okay. So the next thing that the buyer shall do is buyer shall warn and represent within 14 days after the binding agreement date. Buyer shall warn and represent to seller via the notification form or equivalent written notice that the buyer has secured evidence of hazard insurance, which will be effective at closing, and buyer shall notify the seller of the name of the hazard insurance company. So they got to get their homeowner's insurance in place, okay? The second one says buyer has notified lender of an intent to proceed and has available funds to close per the signed loan estimate. So the second step in the lending process is after they make application, once they're under contract, they have under federal law 10 days to sign what is called a letter of intent to proceed. Now, let's say that they go to the lender and they want to get a VA loan, and something's up and they can't get a VA loan, but the lender has given them a loan estimate showing the interest rate and all that stuff for a VA loan. Well, the buyer then decides on day 7 or 8 or even day 10, because they got 10 days to sign that letter of intent to proceed, that they want to change loans and they want to change to a conventional loan. That 10-day time period starts all over. Okay? So back in 2015, the Forms Committee, 2014 and 15 were very hard on us on the Forms Committee because these laws were changing and we had to have a lot of meetings with different attorneys. So what they told us was we had to at least give them the initial 10-day period under federal law. And so we actually are giving them 14 days here. So they could shop their loan, look, change loans and shop different loans if they wanted to, but within 14 days, they have to sign that letter of intent to proceed. So financing is not like it was prior to October of 2015. Then they also have to request that the appraisal be ordered and affirms that the appraisal fee has been paid. Okay, so within 14 days, the buyer's got to do all this, and you do it on the notification form. Okay, it's number 9 on the notification form. The buyer warrants and represents the following, and you check that box and these other 2 boxes, and you put the name of the homeowner's insurance company here. The buyer signs it, and you send it over. Now, there is the possibility that you could do the 3-day thing and the 14-day thing on the same notification form, because the lenders, who I tremendously appreciate, I think, in a lot of instances are doing this. The buyer gets under contract, they go to meet with the lender, or maybe you send the contract package over to the lender, and the lender then completes the application process for the buyer in the computer. It spits out the loan estimate, and they email it to the buyer, or if the buyer's sitting in front of them, they show it to the buyer and they say, how does that look to you? Do you want to move forward? Great. And they go ahead and have them sign that intent to proceed at that same time or with just in a couple of hours. Okay? I think they're doing them both at the same time to try to, they have to be in order to have 30-day closing. They have to be doing that. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the lenders for doing that. So you might be able to make both of those notifications at the same time if during this first 3 days goes ahead and gets their homeowner's insurance too. If they're on the ball and they get everything done, you can make all of these notifications on one form. If not, notification forms in every transaction that wants to, or the buyer may, it says the buyer shall. Okay, so remember, there's a difference in may and shall. So again, if you are working with the seller and you're not receiving these things, then that seller can make that demand for compliance dance. And if the buyer doesn't do it, because we don't do that up here in Decatur, or we don't do that over here in Etowah or Athens or Chattanooga or Cleveland, we don't mess with that. But anyway, I sent you a pre-qualification letter. Why do you need that? Well, for one thing, there's nowhere in the 11 pages of the purchase and sale agreement that says you sending me a pre-qualification or a pre-approval letter negates what the buyer has to do here under the loan obligation paragraph. Nowhere does it say that, because nowhere on that pre-qualification or pre-approval letter does it say that they have made application for the loan. It doesn't say they have homeowners insurance. It doesn't say they've signed an intent to proceed, and it doesn't say that they've requested the appraisal be ordered and paid the appraisal fee. See, that's why those letters are great. I'm not telling you not to get them. They need to go get those and make sure their credit's okay, because that's basically what those letters are doing. They're saying, hey, their credit is where it needs to be in order to have this happen. And so that is a good thing. And keep them going to the bank, get those pre-qualification letters, send them over, but they still have to do this stuff. Okay? Any questions on these things? Anybody have them? Okay. Then number 3 says the buyer shall pursue qualification for and approval of the loan diligently and in good faith. There's that good faith term again, which means they can't just stop trying to get a loan. They can't just stop communicating with everybody. They have to move forward. Buyer shall continually and immediately provide requested documentation to lender and or loan originator. And then number 5, unless otherwise stated in this agreement, buyer represents that this loan is not contingent upon the lease or sale of any other real property, and the same shall not be used as the basis for loan denial. I'm going to stop right there for a second because this is, I have a 2-hour class on that statement right itself. So if your buyer is moving into your market area and they have a house, maybe it's already under contract somewhere else, or maybe they need to sell it before they can buy the house they're offering on, you have to tell everybody because it says unless otherwise stated in this agreement. So what you would need to do is you would need to go to the special stipulations section of the form, and you would need to write lines 76 and 77. Buyer represents that this loan is contingent upon the lease or sale of other real property. And then you got to use the form, the RF 623, the buyer's first right of refusal. So you could make a note there by lines 76 and 77. So again, I don't think I've taught the buyer first right of refusal in Form Friday yet. I don't think. And so we'll get that. That'll come up. So we'll get that. So definitely, this is a little bit of a scenario that it truly makes real estate agents mad at each other. And that's why you need to learn how to do this, and you need to learn how to utilize the RF 623, the buyer's first right of refusal form, because you have to let everybody know that that's the situation. And then number 6, it says, buyer shall not intentionally make any material changes in buyer's financial condition which would adversely affect buyer's ability to obtain the primary loan or any other loan referenced herein. In other words, Mr. and Miss Buyer, don't go out and buy stuff on credit. And don't go out and buy stuff and spend the money you need to close your house. And I have this thing that I give to buyers. It's part of some of the stuff that I put into my buyer's packet materials. And it's called the 10 Commandments when applying for a real estate loan. And I'll share this. I'll upload it into the Google file, SEM Tools, so it'll be in there so you guys will have it. It tells them, don't get married, change jobs, or becoming self-employed or quit your job, because that's going to affect your financial situation. Thou shalt not buy a car, a truck, or a van, or you might be living in that. Thou shalt not use charge cards excessively or let your accounts fall behind. Thou shalt not spend money you have set aside for closing. Thou shalt not omit debts or liabilities from your loan application. Thou shalt not buy furniture or appliances. Thou shalt not originate any inquiries into your credit. Thou shalt not make large deposits without first checking with your loan officer. Thou shalt not change bank accounts, and thou shalt not co-sign for a loan for anybody. So those are some things, and that's a discussion that I have with buyers when we're right here. And like I say, I put that in with my buyer's packet material, and they have it, and I tell them, look at your buyer packet material, let's talk about this. Even if we're doing this digitally, okay, like they're not sitting in front of me. I talk to them about this. I go over this stuff with them. And then again, if they don't meet deadlines, then that seller gets to make demand for compliance. So that's loan obligations, okay? And so these are dates and deadlines that you have to keep up with as the licensee working with the buyer to make sure that buyer is staying on track, okay? Any questions about any of that paragraph? Are you currently doing this at all? I mean, I don't know if you're doing it with the buyers that you have. Are you getting it from the agents that you're working with? I'm going to guess that answer is no in most instances. For some reason, agents think that when, when they get something under contract, the only thing they got to worry about is the home inspection, and that's not true at all. I'm personally, I hate home inspections, but I really personally am worried about that financing. We got to make sure this buyer can buy this house because this seller, especially in this market, this seller could probably sell that house 3 times. And if this buyer's not going to do what they need to do to move forward, then we need to go and find another buyer. That's me working for the best interest of my seller. And me working for the best interest of my buyer is saying, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you got to make this stuff happen because I'm going to be calling you and you're going to be signing other pieces of paperwork within 3 days and then 14 days and depending upon the home inspection time frame, all of that stuff. You know, we're not finished. We're finished looking at houses, but we're just getting started to get you to closing. So you have to help them understand that because they don't always understand that. I was going to see here if I have this form. It's the RF 708, the timeline checklist. Do any of you guys use this at all? The RF 708? So it's a great tool to utilize, and when you go under contract, if your binding agreement date is 2/11, you put this here and you start bouncing everything off, and these blanks here on the left hand side of everything is where you put in the deadline for the items, and then you can check this little box once that is completed. So you can take your purchase and sale agreement, fill out all this information, start counting your days and put your deadlines in there. And I mean, there's a lot of information on here, okay? And some of it might not pertain, you know, if they're not paying cash, then those things don't pertain. But once you fill all this out, give one to the buyer, give one to the other agent, then everybody knows what the deadlines are and when you've got to do things by. I've got right here, right now, I'm still a paper person, okay? So that's just Susan. But right here is, right here's one that I'm working on for 40th Street in Chattanooga. It's a deal I've got going. And I have this, it's all filled out. And I actually write these out because I like to use colored ink, and then I like to scan them off to myself, and it shows up in color. And that's what I send because that color ink stands out for everybody. So I've got my little folders here. Here's my transactions that I'm trying to get closed in February, and I've got one for everybody. Here's the one I just sent the notification form over on. And that's, if you don't keep paper, you can keep it in, you know, you can set it up and put these timeline deadlines in your calendar some way, okay? But that's our job, is to stay on top of this stuff for buyers and sellers.
Can I ask a stupid question? The back on that form you had, where it said acronym BAD, what is that for? What
Right
does that
here,
mean?
BAD.
Yes, where it says within 3 days of BAD, or even up there, binding agreement date. Okay, never mind. Now I see it.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, yeah. And
Okay.
that's a bad thing that us on the forms committee do. We have a lot of acronyms for stuff, like the purchase and sale agreements, the PSA, okay? The BAD is the binding agreement date. And, you know, I don't know why they didn't just put CD for closing. I don't know, but sometimes they do that. They do that stuff. But yeah, that's what binding agreement date is. What is that acceptance date? That was signed as acceptance, and then that is called the binding agreement date for meeting all the timelines. Yep, that's what it is. All right. So that's all about getting a loan, okay, and having a house to sell, whether they're getting a loan or not. If they got a house to sell, you still have to do this number 5. So this financing contingency waive section. This section is extremely important, and here's what you need to put in your brain. Only use this section if that buyer's paying cash and has the cash right now that you can prove, okay? It does say the buyer reserves the right to obtain a loan. If that buyer knows that he can walk into Southeast Bank and get a $500,000 check with no strings attached, that's the kind of loan it's talking about, because it says the buyer's obligation to close shall not be subject to any financial contingency. So if you check this box, then you cannot leave the blank at line 87 blank. You have to put in how the buyer is going to furnish proof of available funds to close, because it says Buyer will furnish proof of available funds to close in the following manner, and you put it in here, a bank statement or a lender's letter within 5 days after the binding agreement date. And if they don't, then you get into that whole demand for compliance dance, which means that if they don't supply that, then the buyer could be considered in default, which means they lose their earnest money and the seller's obligation to sell is terminated. Okay? So it's best just to use this for cash when the buyer has a way to prove they have cash. Okay? And if you are under this financing contingency waive section, you're going that route. If the buyer is going that route and they want to have an appraisal, see, because there's no lender involved, they've got to order their own appraisal. So they're going to have to call some appraisers and get that set up. And when they do that, they only have 5 days after the binding agreement date to get that appraisal set up and notify the seller, here's who the appraiser is, and here's his name and telephone number, and he's going to come on whatever day. You're going to let them know who that appraiser is within 5 days also. And if you don't, then you got that demand for compliance dance. So that's the cash side of everything. And then when you get actually into the appraisal section, this is, you just check a box. The first box is it's not contingent on the appraised value. The second box is it is contingent. Now, I'm going to tell you 99.9% of the time, if the buyer is getting a loan, it is going to have to be contingent on an appraisal. Okay? That just is what it is. So you would be checking box 2. Now, if the appraisal is done and it meets the purchase price on the contract, it equals or exceeds the purchase price, then the appraisal contingency is satisfied. However, if the appraisal comes in low, if it does not equal or exceed the purchase price, then it says the buyer shall promptly notify the seller via the notification form or equivalent written notice. So if you're working with the buyer and you get a phone call from the lender or the buyer that says, hey, the house didn't appraise, then you got to do stuff, okay? You got to fill out the notification form and check the box on that form that says the house didn't appraise or the property, whatever it is, didn't appraise. And once you send that notification form over, if you send it over to me today on the 11th, today's day 0, day 1, day 2, day 3. So again, it would be Monday at 11:50 p.m. The buyer has to either waive the appraisal contingency, which means he has the cash available to pay the appraisal difference, or terminate the agreement. And he can terminate that agreement via the notification form. Okay? So let me get up here. This is the notification form. Here's where you would check the box and say the appraised value didn't equal or exceed, and the buyer will notify the seller of his decision to terminate or waive the contingency within 3 days per the terms stated in the purchase and sale agreement. And then within that 3 days, the reason there's 3 days there is we know that the two agents are going to be talking, and they're going to be talking to the buyer and the seller to see if the seller wants to change the purchase price. Does the buyer have the money to bring the extra money? You're going to be talking. So that's why there's 3 days there. It gives you 3 days to try to maybe work out something else. But please, 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 if you're representing that buyer, do not just let the days go by. You need to either waive or terminate within those 3 days, because if you don't, then the buyer can't use failure to appraise as the basis for a loan denial, okay? Which means they got to buy the house and they got to come up with the money some way. So it's really important that you send this over as soon as you find out the house didn't appraise, and then you talk with the buyer about what he wants to do. They're waiving the contingency here, or they're terminating. Number 6 is they're terminating and they want their earnest money back, okay? So under this paragraph right here, that you gotta watch your timelines and you gotta stay on everything. I know a realtor who had to take $20,000 out of her personal bank account and give it to a buyer to keep the buyer from suing her because she didn't meet the timeline. Okay? She didn't tell them they needed to meet the timeline. So that's very, very important. But you have to send it over and start everything going. Then we get into closing expenses. Now, I know I've been licensed for a very long time, and all my lenders still to this day tell me to pay and closing costs and pre.
Susan, I don't know if you can hear us, but it looks like you've lost connection, or I've lost connection with you. We can't hear you, and it's froze right now. Your screen is.
Are you guys still there? I think I lost internet connection again. Hello?
Yeah, we got you now.
Okay, are you back? I don't see you guys, so I don't know. Okay.
Oh,
Um, can you hear me? Everybody hear me? Michaela's saying she
Yes.
can't. Okay.
we can hear you, but we're not. Yeah, we're not seeing you now.
Huh. Oh, wait a minute. Let me make sure everything's turned on. Are you seeing me?
Yes.
I mean, just I'm not.
Okay.
I'm just seeing the picture, but not your actual video. Okay. Okay.
Now you're
Okay.
seeing everything back, right?
Yes. Yes.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know. They're working back there again. I really wish they wouldn't do this while I'm trying to teach a class. Um, okay, so right now, let's see, I have a question. There's a question here that says, what if they can get a loan, but it is a high interest or unfavorable terms? Can they refuse to take the loan and get out? The answer to that is no. Not if they are, the lender will not give them a loan denial letter because they just don't like it. That's not that just won't happen anymore. Okay. Now that's if they just don't like it. If the interest rate is high and maybe some unfavorable terms, and it pushes their debt to income ratio and something like that, that causes them not to qualify for the loan anymore, that's another show. Okay. If they don't qualify, they don't qualify. But just because they don't like it, that they can't just change their mind and get out. They just can't do that. Um, but thanks for the question. I'm glad somebody's asking questions. So seller expenses, we were talking there, and we were talking about the FERPTA tax, and the FERPTA tax is like a capital gains tax for people who are not U.S. citizens. Under these are differences, and if you look through this document, you will not find the phrase closing costs and prepaids because that's not what it's called anymore. But all the lenders will tell you to ask for closing costs and prepaids, and everybody's been doing it for 100 years, literally, and that's what they're asking for. But you need to understand if you get a seller's agent that understands what closing costs and prepaids are out of this list of buyer expenses, then they can tell the title company we're only paying closing costs and prepaids, and it may not be all the money the buyer needs to close. For example, I had a listing, and the guy wrote the offer up, and he wrote closing costs and prepaids, and a large number, let's say $6,500. I knew what the guy meant, but I also knew that if my seller only paid closing costs and prepaids for that buyer, it would not amount to that much money because that's not what closing costs and prepaids changed it in our counter offer. We were counter offering some price and different things. And when I changed it then um, he counteroffered back, and the only thing he changed was that wording, and he put it back to closing costs and prepaids. And I thought, okay, we can do this. So we got to the closing table, and I sit down with the closing agent. I said, on closing disclosure, please show me what is a closing cost. What is the cost to close this loan? And she checked, showed me some numbers, and I was writing them down. I said, now on this closing disclosure, show me what is a prepaid. And she showed me, and I wrote those down, and it did not total up to what they were charging the seller. And I said, okay, so we need to correct this because you're charging the seller too much money, because the contract says the seller is only going to pay closing costs and prepaids. And she said, yeah, but that's not what we do. I said, oh, so you're telling me you never follow the contract between the buyer and the seller? You just charge whatever? And she said, nobody's ever asked me that, so I'm going to have to answer your question and say, yeah. I said, well, that title company had my sellers a $600 check, and the buyer.
Did everybody else lose Susan or just me?
No, I did too.
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
It would cut out a sentence or two pretty much the whole time, and I thought it was just me.
Yeah.
Definitely makes it more difficult to learn.
Well, the whole thing is the recording's going to cut out too, so it's not like we can re-listen or anything, and I would lose a sentence here or there, and I thought it was just me because I'm sitting in a parking lot in Chattanooga. Does she know that she's gone? Anybody?
Okay, I'm back. Are you there?
We are.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know. They keep doing this, and it's probably going to take us a little bit more than an hour to get through this because of that. I don't know what is going on here at work, but I'm going to give them a piece of my mind, just so you know, as soon as I finish this class. Okay, all right. So you need
We
to
lost
use
you
that
at the.
language.
We lost you at you were writing down the numbers, and they didn't match the 6,500.
Okay, right. So I was writing down the numbers. They didn't match. So the title company then had to write a check, an additional check to the sellers for $600 and something dollars, and the buyers had to pay $600 and something dollars more because I held them to the contract because I represented the seller. So I held them to the contract. That's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to look out for the best interest of my client. Okay? So that's why you got to know about all this stuff. You got to know everything that's going on. So use the language that's in the contract. If you're going to ask the seller to help with the buyer's expenses, call them buyer expenses. And the lenders are going to tell you closing costs and prepaids. And some of the older agents that are around are going to say closing costs and prepaids. Okay? Because everybody kind of knows what that is. But you don't want to get somebody who knows what it is and end up your buyer not having everything they need paid at closing. Okay? So section 3, which is title expenses. The forms committee pulled title expenses out because title expenses are done completely different all across the state and sometimes even different in the same county or the same city. Sometimes the title companies charge the seller for the cost of the title search. Sometimes they charge the buyer for the cost of the title search. Sometimes they split the cost between them. And so you do have to address the title expenses. You cannot leave line 142 blank. So you have to put something here. So it says cost of title search, mortgagee's policy, and owner's policy shall be paid as follows. That means who's going to pay it? By the buyer, by the seller? Do not write on this line the buyer to pay theirs and the seller to pay theirs, because the seller may not have any, and that's just don't even make sense. Okay, so don't put that kind of language. You might put something in here that says buyer and seller shall split the cost of the title search. Buyer will pay for mortgagee's policy and owner's policy. So if your buyer is getting a loan, the lender's going to require a mortgagee's policy. Okay, the buyer can't get around that. They're going to have to pay for that. Can the seller pay for it? Absolutely. If they're paying other expenses for the buyer, the seller can pay that. So you might write something on here like the seller shall pay the cost of the title search and the mortgagee's policy, and the buyer has the option to buy an owner's policy, because an owner's policy is optional. There is no requirement for the owner of real property to buy an owner's title policy. Should they? Absolutely. If they ask you, should I buy that? Yes. Okay. But it's not a requirement like the mortgagee's policy is. So that's why you have to understand how all this works. Now, I'm going to tell you something now that might confuse you, and I don't want to confuse you. I want to show you a way to do this. So let's say that the lender says to you, Susan, the buyer is getting an FHA loan, and they've got their 3.5% down, or their 3%, whatever it is. They've got that money, but they don't have any money to pay. Here's what the lender's going to pay, which is expenses. So we need to ask the seller to pay 4% of the purchase price to cover those expenses. Okay, and they'll always usually give you a percentage. Well, you need to convert that to a number, first of all. So if I have for 100,000,
Susan? It's really confusing when you only get parts of it.
Is she using the negative Wi-Fi still?
up again,
Yes.
and I freeze up again.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me now, though?
We can, but we couldn't hear anything really that you said on that. What we got it was confusing, and then it got really confusing cutting out.
Okay. So it's going to be confusing, and you need to question the lender. So, Mr. or Miss Lender, if you're telling me the seller needs to pay X number of dollars on behalf of the buyer for closing costs and prepaids, does that include the title search, the mortgagee's policy, and an owner's policy? If the answer to that is yes, then what you can do is on line 142, let me see here if I can get, I gave this to everybody, didn't I? Hold on, let me get back up here. This is, actually we loaded it up into the SEM tools, I believe, and this shows you some language. So what you can do is you can say to see lines 146 and 147, okay, put that here on line 142, and then down here on 146 and 147, you can write something like you see this example language right here where it says seller shall pay buyer expenses and title expenses not to exceed $6,500. If the lender is telling you that the number they're giving you that you need to ask the seller for includes the three things that are listed right here, then you can do that. If it doesn't, though, then you're going to have to address this up here. And you may ask the lender, well, could you add in the cost of the title search, the mortgagee's policy, and the owner's policy, and then give me a number? Okay? So, but you have to address these things. And if you're going to ask the seller to pay something on behalf of the buyer, here's where you do it at lines 146 and 147, not in special stipulations. Okay? Because it says right here, not all of the above items, and it lists seller expenses, buyer expenses, and title expenses are applicable to every transaction and may be modified as follows. So this is where you're going to modify the fact that the buyer is not paying their own expenses. Are you confused?
What about if you say each to sell their, or each to pay their own?
Yeah, don't say that. What does that
Okay,
mean?
because you see that all the time.
You do, and I don't know where people are getting that, because if you're not, if the buyer's going to pay their own stuff and the seller's going to pay their own stuff, then you don't need to put anything here because you're not modifying what's up here. Okay, so you don't need to. It doesn't mean anything either. I mean, you've got to tell somebody who's going to pay what. And title companies are just doing what they want to do. They're not even reading this. And if you represent somebody, you need to make sure they're going by whatever is on here. I mean, how many times have you got a call from a title company wanting to know if the buyer wants an owner's policy? I mean, they call and ask you all these questions. Why? Because they're not reading this document. They're absolutely not reading this document. Oh, dear Lord. Did I lose you guys again?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, good. Okay. So the last couple of things in section 2 is the closing agency for buyer and contact information. And the reason that it says and contact information, this is put in to protect you because there's lawsuits where buyers and sellers are suing their agents because they're losing money due to wire fraud. So you absolutely need to put in the full name and contact information of whatever title company the buyer's going to use. Okay? For instance, like if I want to use Realty Title, I would put Realty Title, 1510 Gun Barrel Road, Suite 300, 423-892-1515. Contact is Beth Frost. That way, the buyer and the seller know exactly who they're supposed to be talking to and how to get in touch with them. Okay? So that is there for your protection, because we already have seen cases across the state of buyers and sellers suing their agents because they've lost money via wire fraud. You absolutely should also use the wire fraud notice that we have. What is that? A 30? I don't know what it is. I probably got it in here somewhere, maybe. Y'all know what I'm talking about, though, right? The wire fraud notice form. Still use that form too, but you want to make sure that you fill this information out. So that's basically section 2. And it's pretty intense, and you got to watch for lots of different things in section 2 and keep up with section 2 of the purchase and sale agreement. So it looks, when I lost you guys and came back, before I came back, it looked like there were some questions in chat, but it's not letting me get to chat. Wait a minute, let's see here. It's not letting me see them right now. So did somebody have some questions? And it might have been you telling me you couldn't hear me anymore.
Yeah, that was it. I sent one in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you guys don't have any more questions, then that's all we were covering today is section 2. And we got more coming next week.
This form that you have with all this highlighting and everything, can we download that?
Yes, it's in the SEM tools. If you go to KV Core, and under the cloud stuff, there's a folder there called SEM tools, and you can go in there and get stuff. And we're adding stuff to that on a regular basis. So there's some prospecting stuff in there and different things like that.
Excellent.
Okay.
Question. Does anyone else have a problem getting to the calendar through the SEM tools? Because it's gone now for me.
The calendar's gone?
No, I looked at the calendar this morning.
I tried it the other
too.
day, got my new laptop, and it wouldn't let me open anything. It was just gone.
So let's see here. Company Cloud. You got to go to SEM tools and then go to the calendar. And here's the calendar right here. Are you guys seeing my screen? I switched things around.
Yeah.
And then here's the form stuff that was put in there. So there's different stuff you can get into, and we're adding stuff, as we go along. I don't know. Let me see what's in the forms. So where it says annotated, those are those annotated forms you're seeing. Okay. And I'm probably going to stick that 10 Commandments in there and a couple other things so that you guys can have all that stuff too.
Excellent.
Okay?
Okay.
All right, guys.
But just to be
Please let us
clear
know. Uh-huh.
on the title expenses, so it'd be like if I put title expenses to be split evenly between buyer and seller, is that okay?
Well, not title expenses, title search.
Okay, so you got to specify one of the three things that are listed in title expenses, right?
Yes, you have to see it. It's right here under title expenses, the cost of the title search, because the seller is not responsible for the buyer's mortgagee policy.
Okay, so
And the
put
seller
But you
is,
could still ask for them to split it though.
you could ask for that. You could ask for them to split it if that's what you mean. But now, if I get that and my seller says, I'm not paying for their title policies, why would I do that? Then you're going to cause a counteroffer, which that's okay. But, if you've got somebody on the seller's side that understands this stuff and the seller doesn't want to pay any expenses for the buyer, then they're going to kick that back through a counteroffer because that is not normally the mortgagee's policy or an owner's policy is not normally a seller's expense. You
okay.
could
So
ask for
after you specify that you want the title search split or however you want to do it, do you even need to say anything about buyer expenses and seller expenses?
only if the buyer needs the buyer if the buyer needs the seller to pay something.
Okay, so if everybody's paying their own stuff other than title search, then you don't even got to mention it.
And here's the thing, you need to talk to the title company that's closing the deal to find out who they charge for the title search. So if you've got two or three title companies that you use on a regular basis, you should go ahead and ask them, how do you handle the title search? Who normally pays for the title search in a transaction when it's going to close? They may say the buyer. They may say the seller, or they may say we split it between everybody. So then that's how you got to understand how they work.
Okay.
Yeah. It'd be great to be able just to do it all the time the same way, but that's not what happens. And if you get a counter offer, let's say they're counter offering price and who knows what else, but then that seller's agent is also counter offering the closing company, then when you represent the buyer, you need to get on the phone with that closing company, that title company, and say, okay, how much do you charge to do all this stuff? Is it going to cost my buyer more to use your company than it would to use another company? So you gotta kind of know what these expenses are so you can give the buyer good advice because they all charge something different. They might be real close, but they charge something different. Hmm. That's why it's good to like go to lunch with different title people, or that's why it's good to have title people come into sales meetings and such, so you can talk with them about these things. Because they'll flat tell you what they charge, and some of them like to tell you, "Hey, this is what we charge, and we know we're $100 cheaper than anybody else." Because they set somebody down and have them call people. I know one title company that does that. They have people call and see what other title companies charge, so that they can then come in and beat those charges to buy.
I'm guessing she's gone.
Good morning, sir.
It said she left the meeting, so I suppose we are done.